In the last lesson, we saw how to log in, and this one, we're going to implement logging out of our application. But first, we're going to fix a small little typo that I put in by accident. So if we come down in our user card component, we see that we're getting this red squiggle for an error. And that's because we've got TypeScript enabled on this component. And if we hover over, we see that object is possibly null. And the error here is that I put this optional chaining on the wrong section. So it should be after the value, because user will always have value because it's a ref. It's just whether or not the value itself is null or not. So now that we fixed that up, we can continue on and log out. So the simplest way to handle this is to simply redirect back to the login page. It can get more complicated because with our app, we have the first chapter as free, and then every other chapter we want to protect behind this authentication. And I did explore making the app so that we could, when we log out, it will first check to see if we're on a protected chapter or not. But ultimately, that actually makes it more complicated than it needs to be. And the logic gets really unwieldy, and it's actually better and much simpler to just redirect back to this login page. Ultimately, if someone is logging out, they're probably not interested in continuing with course lessons anyway. So from a UX perspective, this also is the simplest. Our logout method looks very similar to the login method that we had previously. And I'll just copy and paste this one in. We do have a couple slight differences. The first is that instead of grabbing the auth off of the client, we're just going to destructure it right away because that's all we need in this component. And then at the very end, we're going to use our navigate to method. And we're going to go back to this login page. So once we add that in, if we refresh our page and we log in, go to the first lesson, we see that we're logged in. And then if we hit log out, we're taken back to the login page. But if we hit the back button, we see that we're in the app, but we're not logged in. So this works exactly as we want it to. However, we do have a slight issue, and that's to do with how the session for our user is handled between the client and the server. So I actually just did a bit of sleight of hand here. I refreshed the page in between. You may not have noticed that, but if I go back to the login page, if I log in, go to the first lesson, we're logged in, but we're still on the client side. We haven't hit the server yet. If I, without refreshing the page, come back to this logout button, and then we go back again, we'll see that we're still logged in. What causes this error is that the Supabase module doesn't properly update the session on the server side. But when we refresh the page, that does get refreshed. Now, I spent many hours trying to solve this issue and get to the bottom of it, and I dug through the Supabase module code and dug around for many hours, and I simply could not figure out how to get this to work properly. Instead, I came up with a workaround, a bit of a hack, if you will. What this does is simulates what the Nuxt Supabase auth module should be doing, and that is posting to this endpoint and telling the Supabase module that we are now signed out. This is a great instance of putting in a hack that is not really the ideal way of writing the code. And ideally, you'd be able to figure out why the Nuxt stupid-based module is doing this. Maybe we've configured something wrong. Maybe it's a bug in the auth module itself. I don't know. But occasionally, you will need to simply get the thing to work, to ship it. We've all got deadlines. We all have targets that we're trying to hit. We're trying to roll new features out. And we don't always have the time or the ability to figure everything out 100% and make the code perfect. So sometimes you just have to put in a hack like this, get the code to work, and then move on. Now, hopefully in the future, we'd be able to come back to this refactory, clean it up. But for now, the code works. And that's the most important part. So I'll just do a quick demo of this so we can see. If I log out, we go back here. So we'll do the full thing again. We'll log in, go to our first lesson. And now without refreshing the page, I'm going to hit log out. And if I hit the back button, you can see that we are now properly logged out of our application. So now that we have login and log out working, the one thing that we are missing is that even though we're logged in, if I try and go to chapter 2, we're redirected back to the login page. And that's because our route middleware does not check to see if we have a user logged in. So that's what we're going to cover in the next lesson.